Wish You Were Here by Pink Floyd is a great song for improving both your right hand and left hand technique, since it requires you to switch between strumming and picking, and it contains some really cool and challenging chord voicings. Let's take it apart. For the full tab of the entire song, not just the opening section that we're learning here, check out the link in the description. This opening section is made up of 3 4-measure phrases. The first phrase contains 2 chords, E minor 7 and G major. The second phrase also contains 2 chords, the same E minor 7 and a new chord with a fancy name, A7 suspended 4 or just A7 sus 4 for short. The third phrase contains only the G major chord. Phrases 1 and 2 are each played twice in a row before moving on, and phrase 3 is played once. Notice that our 3 chords, E minor 7, G major, and A7 sus 4, all have these 2 fingers in common. These guys don't move at all the entire time. They're what we call pivot fingers because they help you pivot from one chord to the next. Each chord has its own strumming pattern and uses a short series of single notes, which we're going to call a riff, to lead into the next chord. Now, speaking of strumming patterns, quick disclaimer, the strumming in this song is kind of all over the place. He doesn't really play anything the same way twice, so I've streamlined the strumming for this lesson, which means you might hear a little bit of a difference between some of our strumming patterns and what's on the recording, but this will get you 90% of the way there without having to learn a new pattern for every single measure. The section starts with a 4-note riff. First we have a hammer-on from the open A to the 2nd fret, then the open D string, and the 2nd fret of the D string. So the whole thing. That riff leads into our E minor 7 chord, which is played like this. First and second fingers on the 2nd fret of the A and D strings respectively, and 3rd and 4th fingers on the 3rd fret of the B and high E strings, with the low E and G strings open. So it's like a normal E minor chord with these 2 fingers added. Our strumming pattern for the E minor 7 is down, 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 up, up. And you want to be sure whenever you're strumming that your strumming hand is moving steadily and evenly. So you're not doing down, 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 up, up, but instead it's down, skip, down, skip, down, up, skip, up. Then we have our next 4-note riff, the first 3 notes of which are already in the E minor 7 chord, so we don't need to move our left hand right away. We just hit the D string, G string, then back to the D string. Only then do we need to move our left hand because that 3rd note is played staccato, which means we cut it off a little early. We do that by simply releasing the pressure with our 2nd finger. Those 3 notes are followed by the open D string, so the whole riff is. That leads us to our G major, which really just entails us moving our 2nd finger down to the 3rd fret of the low E string and keeping the other fingers where they were. Our strumming pattern for the G is up, down, down, up. And again, we want to keep our strumming hand moving even on the counts where we're not hitting the strings. Up, down, skip, skip, up. And then we're basically going to repeat everything we just played one more time. The only difference this time around is that we're going to put a low G on the 3rd fret of the E string in front of our opening riff. So instead of, we now have. So the first phrase altogether is. For the second phrase, we do our opening riff again with that low G at the beginning, so. Which leads back into the E minor 7 with the same strumming pattern as before. Then we have a new riff. 2nd fret of the D string, open D string, 2nd fret of the A string, and this is another staccato, so we're going to cut it short by releasing the pressure with our finger, and then ending with the open A string, so the whole riff. That riff leads into our A7 sus 4 chord, which we're going to get by moving our 1st and 2nd fingers to the 2nd fret of the D and G strings respectively. That leaves our A string open, and of course we still have our 3rd and 4th fingers on the 3rd fret of the B and E strings. And for this chord, we want to try not to strum the low E string. If you accidentally hit it, it's not that big a deal, but it's going to sound cleaner if you can avoid it. The strumming pattern for this chord is down, down, up, down, up, down. Just like we did with the first phrase, we're going to repeat this second phrase before moving on. The only difference this time is that we don't have that low G at the beginning of the riff. So we're back to just... So the second phrase altogether is... And on to the final phrase. This one starts with the truncated version of the opening riff, just the first 3 notes without the second fret of the D string at the end. That leads into our G major chord, which we're on for the next 3 measures. The strumming pattern for the first measure is down, up, down, down. The second and third measures are both down, 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 up, down. After that, we have a transitional measure that leads us back into the E minor 7, which is where the next section of the song starts. So this last measure is 1 down strum, followed by that version of the opening riff that has the G at the beginning. So the third phrase altogether is... So that's all the technique. Now let's talk about rhythm. This song starts with what's called a pickup measure, which is a partial measure at the beginning of a song or phrase that kind of leads into the first full measure. The classic example of a pickup measure is the song Happy Birthday. The word happy is the pickup and happens before the first full measure. Happy birthday to you. The pickup measure in this song is made up of the first 3 notes of our initial riff, with the 4th note starting the first full measure. And you can hear that, right? That E is a downbeat. It's the one that gets emphasized. So the starting and ending point of our phrases are a little different from where the measures start and end. We have our first phrase starting at the beginning of the pickup measure, which again is a partial measure. Our second phrase starting on the 2 count of the 4th full measure. And our third phrase starting on the 3 count of the 8th measure. That kind of thing isn't particularly unusual, it's just something to be aware of. So I'm going to count through this whole thing, but for the sake of brevity, I'm going to skip the repeats. I'm only going to play each phrase once. 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3, 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2, 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1. As we know, this guitar part uses both riffs and strummed chords, and that's nothing new, right? There are plenty of songs that combine those 2 elements. What's unique about this song, though, is that it doesn't rely purely on the riffs to set it apart. In other words, if you removed all the riffs and were just left with the chords, you'd probably still be able to tell what song it was. And that's not true for a lot of songs. Often someone will come up with a very predictable chord progression and throw in some riffs between the chords to give it a bit more character. It's a testament to David Gilmour's playing and songwriting that even just the chords by themselves are enough to make this song memorable. We are in the key of G major here, so our E minor 7 chord is a 6, our G is of course a 1, and our A7 sus4 is a major 2 chord. Now you might be thinking, Cameron, sus4 chords don't have thirds, and thirds are what make chords major or minor, so how can you call that A7 sus4 chord major? The answer is that you can still refer to what the chord's quality would be if it did have a third. To which you might say, well then you should call it minor because the 2 chord in a major key is minor. And you'd be right, but the guitar solo that happens over this section in the intro contains a couple C sharps during the A chord, and C sharp is the third of A major, not A minor. Even more compellingly, when this section comes back around in the middle of the song, the keyboard plays a regular A major chord over the guitar's A7 sus4, so we can confidently say that this A chord is functioning as a major chord. For the E minor 7, we have two E's, which are root notes, one on the low E string and one on the D string, two G's, which are thirds, one on the G string and one on the high E string, one B, which is a fifth on the A string, and one D, which is a seventh on the B string. The G major chord has three G's, which are roots on the low E string, the G string, and the high E string, one B, which is a third on the A string, and two D's, which are fifths on the D string and the B string. And the A7 sus4 has two A's, which are roots on the A and G strings, one E, which is a fifth on the D string, one D, which is a fourth on the B string, and one G, which is a seventh on the high E string. We're using what I call a scale degree 6 pattern of the G major scale in this song, which is a multi-octave pattern starting on scale degree 6, which is our open low E string. The single octave patterns that make up a scale degree 6 pattern are the tail end of a second finger pattern, into a fourth finger pattern, into another second finger pattern. So we can use those scale patterns to see how everything we're playing in this section fits into the key. Our opening riff is scale degrees 2, 3, 5, and 6, which leads into our 6th chord, which is made up of scale degrees 6, 3, 6, 1, 5, and 1. Our next riff is scale degrees 6, 1, 6, 5, and that leads into our 1 chord, which is made up of scale degrees 1, 3, 5, 1, 5, and 1. After that, we do our opening riff again, but with a scale degree 1 in front of it, so 1, 2, 3, 5, 6. Then of course we're back to the E minor 7, which we've already analyzed. Our next riff comes in our second phrase and is 6, 5, 3, 2, and that leads into our major 2 chord, which is made up of scale degrees 2, 6, 2, 5, and 1. The other thing I want to point out is that David Gilmour uses a 12-string guitar on this song, so if you're wondering why when you play it, it doesn't have quite the same shimmer to it, that's probably why. Real quick before we get to the demos, thank you so much for watching. If you found this video helpful, please give it a like and subscribe to the channel. And if you have any requests for what song I do next, you can leave those in the comments.